bring in Markos Kounalakis. He is a foreign affairs columnist for McClatchy News. He is also a visiting fellow at the Hoover Institution. Markos, thanks so much for being with us. All right, you just saw it there. The president put the most positive spin possible on North Korea's action. So what is the president's strategy here, especially after his own talks with North Korea broke down earlier this year?
Paula, it's a really interesting and a very simple strategy, actually. The president of the United States is running for re-election. He's been doing it since he was elected took office in 2017. He is continuing to campaign. That's why he sides with Kim Jong-un and criticizes Vice President Joe Biden. It's also why he's making these types of overtures to Kim Jong-un to try and actually get to a negotiated settlement, to come up with something that looks like a victory by next year's election. The one thing we should note, though, is while he says there are no long-term ballistic missile tests, that's true as far as the United States is concerned. If you're sitting in Tokyo, a short-range ballistic test looks just like a long-range ballistic test. They are within range. So if you're sitting in Tokyo, you're the prime minister, you're worried.
So a lot of people were worried about what kind of message this would send to our allies. Here the president is at a press conference with Shinzo Abe on his home turf, openly disagreeing with him. But from what I hear you saying is it really doesn't matter about our allies, it's all about the base.
Yes, it's all about the base as far as the president is concerned, and it's all about perspective as far as the Japanese prime minister is concerned, because for him, it is an existential question whether or not North Korea has those arms, whether it is nuclear armed. And remember, on this Memorial Day here in the United States, where we're thinking about our soldiers, the Japanese, not because it's Memorial Day, are thinking about their civilians and those who perished at the end of World War II as a result of atomic bomb attacks. I mean, it was a brutal war, but nuclear energy, nuclear weaponry is especially sensitive for those in Japan.
And Markos, one of the big headlines coming out of that press conference was President Trump saying he supported Abe's interest in mediating talks between the U.S. and Iran. The Japanese prime minister could visit the Middle East as early as next month. So how significant is this, especially as the U.S. is committing more military assets to that region?
Well, it's a good question, Paula, because what we have to recognize is that Japan is highly dependent on oil and fuel that comes from other countries. They do not have their own resources to develop and to be able to fuel their entire nation. So they rely on imports from the Gulf region. You have to also remember that they recently took one of their nuclear power plants offline, so they are even more dependent on those energy resources that are able to come from around the world, and in particular from the Gulf region. So the fact that Shinzo Abe is actually going out to try and mediate is a good thing for the United States. It means there's one more world leader who's putting himself between Iran and the United States where the tensions are rising. But it's also very clever of him in terms of his self-interest and making sure that his nation can continue to grow, can have the resources that they need for a growing economy.
Now, switching topics a little bit to trade and tariffs. Those have, of course, been a major topic of discussion during the president's trip. And this comes as the president has struggled, really, to negotiate a trade deal with China. You heard him make kind of a push for getting a trade deal with Japan, but then during this trip, he's kind of backed off of that.
Yeah, it's because there are local elections coming up in Japan that I think he's actually giving the prime minister some cover right now. And so they're going to wait until the next meeting in Japan, which is coming up in a couple of months. It's going to be an economic meeting, G20. And so he is going to actually let those elections take place. He's not going to put pressure on the prime minister and his party. But make no mistake, as we said at the very beginning of this conversation, the president is looking at how he's going to get reelected. And part of that message, a big part of that message, is those trade negotiations that he's trying to have with China, those trade deals that he's trying to close with Japan, especially in an environment where this president has rejected President Obama's TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership that was going to allow us some kind of trade access. So he's got to come up with something that is a bilateral deal that is a good deal for the United States, that recognizes how much Japan is investing in the United States in the auto industry, for instance, but is also going to be able to play back at his base. Again, the campaign, the presidency, the re-election. How is he going to get that Japanese money into the United States and get American cars out of the United States?
All right, Markos, it's all about that base. That's what I've learned. Thank you so much for your great insights. We really appreciate it.
Thanks, Paula.